Hi there, I'm Wendy McCallum, burnout and alcohol coach and wellness expert, and you're listening to Bite Size Balance, where everyday extraordinary women share their stories, expertise, and wisdom, all in the name of lifting each other up and creating a better life by design. Whether it's wellness, career, relationships, food, alcohol, mindfulness, hormones, or parenting, we talk about all things women's balance. If your life looks great on paper, but it still feels like something's missing, you're in the right place. Welcome to Bite Size Balance. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Bite Size Balance. I have a really fabulous guest today. I think this is going to be such an interesting conversation. Today, I have with me Dr. Michael Amster, who is the co-author of the new book, The Power of A, with Jake Eagle. Dr. Amster is a doctor, obviously, but also an A researcher, and that's A.W.E, if you're curious what I'm saying there, A, and a teacher at the University of California, Berkeley Greater Good Science Center. He's a pain management specialist with over 20 years of experience and has also been meditating for 30 years himself and is a certified yoga and meditation instructor. And he's here to tell us what he and Jake discovered a few years ago, right at the beginning of the pandemic, about the power of microdosing A and how it can impact almost every aspect of your physical, mental, and emotional well-being. And the thing that really got me, that I hope keeps you here and listening to the rest of this conversation, is that the research that they gathered is very, very compelling. And what it suggests is that by simply engaging in this 5 to 15 second practice several times a day, you could actually get the same benefits as you would from a much more time-consuming daily practice of meditation. So for anyone who's struggled with meditation, who has tried it and hasn't been able to make it stick, or just feels like it's way too time-consuming, and definitely for anybody who's interested in gratitude and dabbled in that and found that to be incredibly beneficial, I think you're really going to love this conversation today. Hello, Dr. Amster. How are you?
Hi, Wendy. It's so wonderful to be here with you this morning, and I'm really appreciative that you've invited me to be here today, and I get to meet your community of listeners. So thank you for this honor and opportunity. Much appreciate that.
You're so welcome. It's actually very exciting to be able to talk to somebody about these concepts that I talk a lot about. As I was saying to you before we hit record, I talk a lot about my own experience with gratitude and my own experience with meditation, and how for me that really tied into me solving some problems that were going on in my life, but also getting through some really tough times. But I am by no means an expert in either of those things. And when I was reading your book, The Power of A, I was thinking to myself how interesting it was going to be to talk to you about this, because there seemed to be so much overlap with a lot of the things that, you know, maybe I already do, or ways that I have been thinking that I know have been serving me, but I haven't been able to put my finger on why. And so I'm really excited to talk, especially about some of the science behind all of this, in terms of, you know, why the emotion of awe and learning how to practice it and sort of hone it is actually, as you say, leads to this change in not in your physical, your mental, your emotional well-being, and just how that's all connected. I think it's going to be a really interesting conversation. So thank you for being here. Are you in California?
Yeah, I'm in Santa Cruz, California.
Excellent. Probably much nicer there than here. We're about to have a big snowstorm, so
We've had
crossed.
a pretty wild and wet winter here, actually, but yeah.
I've heard that. So,
yeah.
So the book is called The Power of A, and I actually spelt it in the intro because I thought people are not going to know what I'm saying when I say the power of A, because A is not, I know it's gaining traction, but it's not a word that a lot of us use. It's not part of our sort of everyday language. And so maybe we can just start with that. When you're talking about A, what is that?
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, a lot of people have a hard time defining what awe is. Well, if you think about a moment of awe that you perhaps had in your life, for most people, it's a moment of extraordinary awe. You know, like when maybe you've been to the Grand Canyon, or you visited up in Canada, you know, Banff or Lake Louise, and you look out at Lake Louise and like there's this incredible vastness. And in that experience of being there, it almost scrambles your mind. It's like, wow, like how's it even possible that this was created, and how much beauty there is here? So we define awe as an emotional experience in which we sense being in the presence of something that transcends our normal perception of the world. And when researchers look at awe, there's sort of two aspects. One is that awe creates a sense of vastness, and it can be vastness outside, but more importantly, it's vastness within ourselves. It changes our sense of egoic self. Instead of being very self-centered, our sense of self diminishes, and then we feel connected to the vastness of the universe, or connected to God, connected to all life on this planet. It gives that sense of vast connection. And secondly, is that the scientists talk about this idea of cognitive accommodation, which is when our sense of reality gets shifted. Like, we have a change in our level of consciousness. We see things differently. We open up with fresh and new eyes. We can look at problems that we've had in the past and be able to see new ways of relating and being with them. And what's really unique about our research is that we have been teaching people how to experience these moments of awe in the ordinary. So prior to our research, the whole world of awe was studying extraordinary awe. They would either take people to really extraordinarily beautiful places, or they'd have them put on virtual reality headsets and imagine them, see themselves flying over a national park or being up in outer space and seeing the planet and really having an immersive experience. But the problem is that it's not a sustainable practice. Like, we need to be able to find awe in the ordinary wherever we are. And so what we did was came up with this methodology that takes 5 to 15 seconds to do, to find a moment of awe wherever you are, at any place, anytime. And then we did the science to back it up. And we know that the methodology works with incredible benefits of improvement of mental and physical health.
Yeah, it's so cool. We're going to talk more about that. I have to say, for people listening, like, when I first started reading this book, I thought, I forget the first example you gave. I think it was a painting or something. You said, look for something around you in the room that you might be able to focus in on, that has some value to you. And so I happened to be sitting on my bed, and there was a painting across from me, and I looked at the painting, and I thought, okay, it's nice, but how am I going to get, because I had this same as I think most people do, this idea that awe meant extraordinary awe. So I was looking for that extraordinary awe and that feeling that I know goes along with that. But I did do the awe technique that you're going to talk about in a second. And I did actually have a very kind of cool experience with that painting, where I noticed something I hadn't noticed before, where I started thinking, wow, isn't it so neat how this person has been able to do this thing with the layering here. And then I had one other awe-inspiring experience last night, where I actually looked at my bathtub and had a moment of awe. I thought about how a cave person would see a bathtub. Like, if they could see my bathtub, how that person would think about, like, how miraculous the bathtub was. So this actually works. So stick with us. It's very cool. I was skeptical, but it's something that I'm really, really intrigued with. How did you guys start researching this? Were you guys friends, colleagues, you and Jake? And how did this research come about? It was a few years ago you started this, right?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I love the examples you gave, and we'll touch on. We come up with this idea that there's 3 categories or types of awe that we can kind of identify to help us learn how to cultivate awe. And so you just talked about 2 of them and the examples you gave. So we'll touch on that a little bit later to give people a teaser. But yeah, so Jake Eagle is a psychotherapist. He lives in Hawaii with his wife, Hannah, and they've been leaders of a spiritual mindfulness community called Live Conscious. They have a website, liveconscious.com. And I met Jake about 16 years ago after going through divorce. And a friend of mine told me about him and his retreats that him and his wife lead. And yeah, he became a coach, a mentor of mine, and really helped me through some challenging times in my life, and taught me an incredible amount. And I've been a student of mindfulness well before that. I started studying meditation and mindfulness when I was in college to help me cope with test-taking anxiety that I had. I always wanted to be a doctor since I was a little boy. And as the stakes kind of got higher through high school and then in college, and knowing I had to take this big entrance exam to medical school, I had a full-on panic attack, which I'd never had before. And experiencing that crazy racing monkey mind, the heart racing, my mind shutting down, can't focus on the exam, running out of the test sobbing because I was so freaked out. And so from that, I started studying more seriously meditation, particularly what's called Vipassana. It's a form of Buddhist meditation, breath awareness, body awareness. And so it's been a really long journey for me. I mean, about 30 years. And I got trained as a mindfulness teacher about 12 years ago at a center here in California called Spirit Rock, in a 2-year intensive program. I've led hundreds of patients. I'm a chronic pain specialist in California, and I've led hundreds of patients through mindfulness programs for managing pain. And so I was taking a class of Jake's about 4 years ago called Thrill to Be Alive. And part of the class was a homework assignment of doing a 10-day meditation, 10-minute meditation a day. And a lot of the participants said, oh, I don't have time to do that. And you and I were talking about this, like how so many people feel like they don't have the time to have a formal meditation practice. And so Jake and I had this conversation, what if we could come up with this ideal brief mindfulness practice where it just took 15 seconds to do, and you would have profound benefits from the practice, equal to sitting for 10 or 15 minutes a day.
Mm-hmm.
And I flew out to Hawaii, where he lives. And as you all can imagine, Hawaii is filled with a lot of extraordinary awe. It's kind of everywhere around you. Beaches, the mountains, the food, the colors, everything is incredible. And it was actually in this moment of making pancakes for Jake and Hannah one morning where I had this epiphany and this really orgasmic experience. For those of us that are, high achiever, multitaskers, I had always made pancakes, poured the batter, and then I'm off running while the pancakes cook, making coffee, orange juice, making my kid her school lunch, making sausage, whatever, and then coming back and then flipping the pancakes and hoping they don't burn.
Yeah.
Well, this time I just stood there and I watched the pancakes cook in the whatever minute or two that it took. And I was just blown away. I had this moment of profound awe of like, wow, like this, like the circumstances, the conditions that allow this to happen, like how a liquid batter that tastes like goop turns into a fluffy, light, delicious, savory treat. So, yeah, we dissected kind of what had happened, and we discovered from this what we call the A method, and we actually use the word A.W.E, into a 3-step process of which we believe is sort of that ideal brief mindfulness experience that you can microdose throughout the day, and then have these really profound changes in your level of consciousness, giving you really a sense of that experience of nirvana. Nirvana is the term that they use in Buddhism. It's sort of like that state of enlightenment, that transcendent state where one experiences time standing still or expanding, where our thoughts slow down or stop, where we experience spaciousness, that vastness, that connection to all life. It's that kind of what they call the non-dual, the experience where there's really less of a separation between me and everything else, but we feel a sense of oneness and connection and vastness. So, yeah, and then from that from that design, we taught a 21-day program to both of our patients in a small group and saw some initial preliminary data that was really off the charts incredible. And then I tracked down Dacher Keltner. He's the founder of the Greater Good Science Center at the University of California at Berkeley, which is a psychology, sociology research center focused on looking at positive emotions and mindfulness and really how to make the world a much better place for the individual and society. Well, when I shared our initial data, he was just like really blown away of what we had designed. Like I said, all the research prior to ours was on extraordinary awe. And then here we came up with this very simple technique that is very easy to do, that's effortless, that takes seconds to do, and had profound results. So then from that conversation, we designed 2 large, robust studies with his lab grad students and his assistants. And then we taught the A method to about 300 patients during the height of the pandemic, as well as 200 doctors and nurses on the front lines managing COVID at the height of the worst time of the pandemic of June of 2020.
Yeah. And then, so what were the results? because now everybody wants to know. I mean,
Yeah, well,
I think it's really cool that you were able to do this at the beginning of the pandemic. I thought it was really interesting how this came out of, I wondered whether there was some connection with just the way everyone was feeling. Like, I feel like awe is the opposite of what we felt during the pandemic. Like, that global feeling of just complete hopelessness and fear and anxiety and all of the unknowns that were associated with that. When I was reading about how the awe research started at the beginning of the pandemic, I thought, isn't this so interesting that this emotion is the emotion that you chose to focus on at the beginning of one of the most hopeless times definitely in recent history that we've had as globally. Was that a coincidence?
Well, yeah, it's just how the timing worked out.
Yeah.
I had met Dacker right before the pandemic started in February, and we had breakfast together. I shared our data, and then the pandemic, closed everything down in March. And I remember this conversation I had with Jake, and we're like, well, it would be great to help people everyone's struggling right now. What can we do to make a difference in the world and really help people? And so out of that, we birthed this idea of let's do some studies here. And, everything that was shut down. So we had time, the grad students seemed to have time, we all kind of were able to fast track and focus and get this done. We're doing more research on all right now, and it's taken us like over a year to get the whole planning stage and the institutional approval review, but we were able to do this in 6 weeks. I mean, literally from the idea of doing the study to starting it took about 6 weeks to do, and getting all the approval and all this stuff put together. So it was pretty miraculous, really, that we were able to do this. And we taught a 21-day program where we met about four 1-hour sessions over Zoom. And we did daily metrics and pre and post measures as well. And we looked at different areas. And like you said, it was at the height of what really was the worst point of the pandemic. Vaccines were far away. The race riots, the George Floyd stuff was horrible here in the United States. In fact, our study commenced on the day when the riots all started happening. It was such a horrific time of people feeling depressed and anxious, like you talked about, it really existential anxiety where people weren't sure we're going to live through this, and also severe loneliness. And so in our book, we share the measure tools, a lot of the tools that we used in our study, so you can kind of test yourself and see where you fall in the scores. But we looked at depression, and our results were extremely robust. I mean, we saw a 35% reduction in depression from a technique that we asked people to do just 1 minute a day. So we asked them to do this 5 to 15 second mindfulness technique 3 times a day at least, and then followed their states of depression. And our results are really equal to that of taking like a pharmaceutical for depression, like a Prozac, or equal to doing intensive psychotherapy. Because this technique is so powerful, and what we saw in the results, we really think of it as like a medical intervention. That like this is actually a tool equal to like a pharmaceutical or doing psychotherapy, and definitely can be used together. Like you can use this in tandem with everything else. But the beautiful thing is that this is widely available. Once you learn the technique, it's widely available. It's free, and we didn't see any side effects in our study. We also saw statistical significant decreases in anxiety, decreases in loneliness, which is a very interesting aspect, because here people were still alone, sheltering in place, but yet there's a unique aspect of the emotion of awe, which is that you feel a sense of connection to God or the universe or to all life just by the design of what awe does within us. And then how it changes our physiology with oxytocin, and how that all connects together. We also saw decreases in chronic pain, other chronic health symptoms like headaches and fatigue. And then we saw improvements of overall sense of well-being. And one of the really neat things that we saw in our results was that there's what's called the dose effect. So we asked people just to dose at least 3 times a day of these moments of awe. But the more you dose awe, the more benefit you have. So it has a cumulative effect. There's no downside. And eventually what will happen, and what we've learned from our study participants, is that you will then experience spontaneous moments of awe. So what we're doing in learning the A method and teaching this in our studies is we're giving people some training wheels to learn to build a habit, to give themselves the wiring in their nervous system so that this brief technique becomes spontaneous, really, and that you then start to walk out into the world and see awe everywhere around you.
Yeah.
And that's really that's the ultimate goal, is to just live in that constant state of awe and wonder, and to really imbue that in your life.
Yeah, it's almost like you figure out how to make mindfulness mindless. It just starts happening. It just, and it's so interesting. We talked about this a little before I hit record, but this is making me think of it again. It sounds so much like gratitude to me. Now, my practice of gratitude is like my own weird hybrid thing that I created after researching and reading a million different things about gratitude. And so I'm not necessarily talking about every person's, practice of gratitude, but when I was reading this book, I was thinking, gosh, this is happening to me all the time. This awe, I wasn't calling it awe, I was calling it wonder or gratitude. And not everything I'm grateful for is necessarily an awesome, I was going to say awesome moment. But it's a lot of it is. And also, the thing that whenever I'm describing my experience with gratitude, I always say that eventually it just got to this point where my brain was just seeing it all the time. My brain was seeing all these little joyful things happening all around me, noticing it without me having to prompt myself to do that. And it sounds like the same thing happens with this practice of awe, and I like the word spontaneous is a better word than any other word I've used for it. The idea that this just becomes spontaneous for you, and your brain just is presumably you're just developing a neural pathway, and it just once you walk it enough times, it just becomes the path of least resistance for your brain. Is it that kind of thing that's happening?
Yeah, well, in terms of what's happening is, what we're doing is we're repeating this this method enough times that instead of it just being a temporary state, it becomes our more permanent trait. It's like who we are. We become someone who lives life and just walks and interacts in the world in a state of awe and wonder. And that's really the ultimate goal. We had talked a little bit, before we started the recording about there's a difference between awe and gratitude.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of helpful to give a little bit more of a background in terms of the philosophy of how this works and what we believe is going on. And what we talk about in our book, and we have a whole section of the book dedicated to this, is what's called the idea of the 3 levels of consciousness. And this is really the life's work of Jake and Hannah, and kind of what they've sort of come up with and mastered as a model. And the idea is that depending on the state of consciousness that we're in, how we're looking out there and behaving in the world, when things arise and happen, and in psychology, the model is what's called the stimulus and response model. I mean, this is how all psychotherapy is looking at, an event happens, and then we have a response to that event. So let's say we're driving our car down the highway, and someone cuts us off and gives us the finger, and then there's a little gap of time, and then we have a response. Now, mindfulness is actually similar to cognitive behavioral therapy. It's teaching us to notice what happens between that stimulus and response. We extend that gap, so to speak, and noticing our reaction and what are we going to do in this type of situation. That's what mindfulness hopefully is teaching us to do. Well, if you look even before the stimulus and response, what level of consciousness we're in, that's going to fully dictate how we respond to a situation. And what I mean by that is that most of the time we're living, 99% of the time, we're living in what's called, in this model, safety consciousness. It's not that it's bad that we're in safety consciousness, but that's just the state of consciousness that we are in when we are, raising our kids, when we're going to work, when we're in line at the airport, going through security, or we're just living our day-to-day normal life. We're really in more of a state of looking for potential threats, and we're being proactive and managing just the things that are constantly hitting us in life. And then the next heightened level of consciousness above being in safety is what we call heart consciousness. And heart consciousness is where we access the state of the emotion of gratitude. which is what you're talking about, appreciation and gratitude. And so even right now, while we're talking, if we just bring to mind something we're grateful for, or immediately, like I notice my consciousness level sort of shifted a bit. Like I feel a warmth in my heart. I was thinking about my daughter, who is a college student now, graduating soon, but she's going to have dinner with me tonight. So I thought about her and like how excited I am about that and how grateful I am that we're close. And so that brings me to a different state of consciousness. And so like if I share that initial example of someone cutting me off and I'm feeling a place of appreciation and gratitude, my reaction is going to be different. I'm not going to flip them off.
Yeah.
I'll probably be like, yo, bro, like, peace out. Like I'm feeling grateful that we're alive and we're safe and an accident didn't happen.
Mm-hmm.
Well, awe is actually the next level up in terms of this model of consciousness. And that's what's called spacious consciousness. And spaciousness or spacious consciousness is that place where we go to when we're practicing like a deep meditation or prayer or chanting, or we're having a moment of awe. And what's unique and different between these two states is that when you're in a state of awe, there is no thought going on. Like it's really a mindless state.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really a big distinction between gratitude, because to have a moment of gratitude, you have to think about it.
Right.
You make a list in your mind, or you like identify and you have a thought. Well, when we're doing the awe method and we're in that state of spacious consciousness, we're just in pure awareness. We brought our attention to something that we value, appreciate, and find amazing. We're just fully there without thinking about, oh, I'm grateful for this, or, oh, imagining life without this and what it would be like. So yeah, I hope that
Yeah.
explains the
No,
difference
that
between
does.
the two.
Yeah, no, that totally makes sense to me. And so when you're using the awe technique, which we do need to talk about, because now people are like, what is this thing? So we'll talk about that next. But when we're using that 3-step technique, so the question I would have for you is, it felt to me now, listen, I've been practicing for 24 hours, so it hasn't been that long, but it felt to me like I did have to do some thinking in it. I had to think, okay, what is it I'm supposed to be thinking about when I'm looking at this thing to create this feeling of awe? And so I would be thinking, for example, with the bathtub, like, what is it about this bathtub that's cool and awe-inspiring, because otherwise it's just a bathtub. So is the thinking piece of it that you're talking about that disappears at that third level of consciousness, is that something that only happens once you get to spontaneous awe? Or is that something that's happening when you're in the early stages of practicing finding and feeling awe? Does that question make sense?
Yeah, I think that it's different for everybody. Again, we're giving people these training wheels by learning what we call the awe method.
Mm-hmm.
And so for you, you've just been doing it, let's say, for 24 hours. Well, you do have to think about it, and you're learning these 3 steps and kind of learning what works for you with them. But in time, if you do this for 21 days, I'm sure by day 2 or 3 or even 4, you wouldn't need to think about it much anymore. You just sort of go through the process, and it becomes really more or less spontaneous.
Yeah.
You don't really have to put any effort out to make it happen.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. And I think,
Mhm.
as I was saying to you earlier before we hit record, I think like that sometimes that's happening to me with things that I end up feeling gratitude for at some point during the day, but they're in the moment that they're happening. I'm not thinking about it. I'm just experiencing it, and it just feels so good. And so I guess you could have gratitude for a moment of awe.
Well, when you find something that you're grateful for, you can then go to the next level with that thing and then have a moment of awe with it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's cool. Yeah,
because part of the practice is identifying something that you value, appreciate, or find amazing. So that first step might be the identification, where you do experience the gratitude, and then the next step after that would be to like really bring your full attention to that and just being with it, and then letting that experience expand within you and really fill you up. So it would be like gratitude, 2.0. It's like taking gratitude to the next level, which you're then transforming your gratitude into a state of awe.
Yeah. Which I just think I think that's so cool. And that's why when I was reading this book, I was thinking, this is amazing, because all the research I read about gratitude that convinced me to give it a shot after years of saying, like, this is a ridiculous thing for like women with too much time on their hands and Oprah. Like, that's sort of how I felt about gratitude until I did the research. And it was so compelling in terms of the parallels between the benefits, like more established benefits of meditation, and what they were finding out about gratitude, and how gratitude was impacting people's emotional, physical, and mental well-being. And so when I read this book, I thought, well, this is like just like you said, almost like a 2.0, like it's an up leveling for somebody who has. But at the same time, you can just jump right into this if you've never meditated and you've never practiced gratitude. And in fact, it might be a really accessible entry point for you because of the simplicity and the brevity of the practice. So can you explain the A method and because each letter, it's like an acronym, it stands for each stage of the method, right?
Right. Yeah. So exactly. Yeah. I'll talk through the A method. And I'm also mindful that, for me, when I listen to my podcast, I'm pretty much always driving in my car. So I don't want to give someone like an orgasmic experience and then accidentally crash their car. So
Right.
I definitely would recommend you check out the book, The Power of A. Our website, thepowerofawe.com. We have a lot of free material. We have free meditations. We have videos that explains it more. We also have in our book, as well as some of them on our website, but we have these extended awe practices. So
Yeah.
it's really, and I think some of those practices they're worth their weight in gold, really. Like I've heard from people that have been practicing some of them. Like there's one about having a real like awe inspired hug. And there's like, yeah, I've never had a better hug in my entire life. When you bring awe to a hug, it's just really quite transformative and powerful. But anyway, the brief kind of overview of the 3 steps. So again, we use the word awe, A.W.E. It's an acronym that we've created. So A stands for attention. And so what we're doing is we're asking you to bring your full undivided attention to something that you value, appreciate, and find amazing. So right now I'm on video with you and we're talking, and I see this like big key on your doorknob behind you. And so I'm like, wow, it's this beautiful silver giant key that looks like it's like about 10 inches long. And so I'm bringing my attention to that, and I'm just being with it. And the next letter, W, is wait. And so the wait is that mindful pause. We're just being fully with that object and waiting. And usually it's like a cycle of a breath or two. And I'll tell you why the wait is so powerful is that if you think about it, but let's say you're walking with a friend and they're ahead of you and they hold the door open for you and they're waiting for you to go through. Like it is such a gift when someone waits for you. I mean, it feels so good. And it's such a sign of love and kindness and respect and compassion. And what we're doing is we're waiting for ourselves. We're giving ourselves that level of love, that kindness, that respect, because we're all so busy these days. So we're just giving that mindful wait for 5 to 10 seconds of just through a cycle of a breath. And then the E stands for 2 things. One is a deep exhale. So we want to make our exhale longer than our inhale, almost like when you make the word awe, like,
Right.
And when we have that longer exhale, what happens is we stimulate our vagus nerve, which is the master computer of the autonomic nervous system, the fight or flight response versus the rest and healing, digestion, recuperating state. So we're like optimizing our nervous system for that healing state. And then the last part is this idea of expansion. That E also stands for expansion. And when we allow that moment to expand in us and to really fill us up, and you can think of it as an energy, if that works for you, like in your mind's eye, think of like a bunch of light or energy expanding in you. But when we have a moment of awe, if you think about it like that extraordinary awe, and you start to get your body tingles, or you feel chills, you feel like the hairs are rising on your arms. Mm-hmm. It's because you have all this energy. You actually are physically feeling an expansion of energy. And so what you're doing is you're really just cultivating that energy to really welcome it, to allow it to happen in that moment.
Mhm.
And quite often I let that energy get bigger than me. I let it expand outside of me. And that's when you really feel the kinesthetic feeling of awe.
Yeah,
And then
it's
it's
so
nice to have a moment of reflection. We just think back about, oh, wow, look what just happened. Like that reflection is really a state of also enjoying the reward. What's beautiful about an awe moment is that it feels good. There's an immediate reward. Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah. And it's really simple and accessible. Even though it might seem, if you're listening, you might be thinking, how am I going to get this feeling of awe from a key or from a, from a painting or from a bathtub? It's just really interesting if you do that weight piece, how that sort of comes to you. Like I looked at the bathtub and thought, this is not going to work. Like I don't know what about this bathtub is awe-inspiring. And then the weight of the, the inhale, exhale breath in between there, it created some space for that thought to pop into my mind about how kind of amazing this bathtub actually was. The fact that I can fill it up with hot water and how mind-blowing that would be if you were a cave person. Don't know where it came from, but it came.
Yeah. I mean, that's a beautiful example of what we call, so we break up onto 3 different categories, so to speak. And so the easiest one for people usually to access and to start with is what's called sensorial awe. So that's awe of the senses. And that's the awe you have when you look at a beautiful sunset, or you're walking your dog down to the park and you're noticing the leaves or the feeling of the wind on your face,
Mhm.
or you're tasting amazing food or listening to incredible music. I mean, those are all awe of the senses.
Mhm.
And then the bathtub example is what we call conceptual awe. And it's like the idea of concepts that kind of blow our minds.
Mhm.
When you think about like, wow, what does a bathtub do? And like how it creates, so much sanitation and pleasure in our lives. And or like we give an example in our book about a doorknob.
Yes, I love that
Um,
example. Can you share that example?
well, the doorknob was actually invented by a young Black man in the 1800s, like right, after the Civil War, who'd been enslaved. And you think about this kid basically invented a doorknob, which we all benefit from today. Like it's ubiquitous to our living is to have doors with knobs, and to
Yeah.
imagine like how that individual created that invention.
Yeah.
It's really awe-inspiring.
Yeah.
And then the last sort of the 3 categories of awe is interconnected awe, and that's the awe we have with other sentient beings, our pets and our friends, our family, loved ones, or even strangers. I mean, we can have a moment of awe connecting with a stranger in line at the airport,
Mhm.
or in line at the grocery store. Like we can have a moment of awe looking at strangers and being awe-inspired by the quirkiness of people.
Mhm.
I'm always having moments of awe with my patients,
Yeah.
which by the way is a great way to prevent burnout, in terms of people that
Yeah.
work in service industries, is to find
Yeah.
awe in those interactions with people.
Yeah. And that's another thing I wanted to talk to you about, because I know you told me before we hit record that you've had your own personal burnout experiences. I've obviously had personal burnout experiences. I'm a burnout coach. It's like just my life is all about fight or flight and chronically elevated cortisol. So one of the things that I liked about this was the idea that you could use this as a way to help manage or prevent burnout. You could use this as as a protracted daily practice, which is something I always talk about around gratitude as well. But I could totally see how this. So can you explain that a little bit? Like maybe go a little bit, if you don't mind, into. I've just found the whole bit about inflammation and cytokines and the stress response and how awe plays into all of that. I found that all really fascinating. And I don't know if this is connected or not, but I'm going to throw it into the question. And if it's not, don't answer it, and that's fine. But I also thought it was fascinating how the research has started to shift towards the evolutionary rationale for positive emotions, and how those have actually the role that they serve, I guess, in terms of our evolution as humans, and how we have previously been focused on negative emotions like anger and fear and anxiety and those types of things as being the helpful emotions in terms of how we've evolved and keeping us safe and alive. So those are 2 kind of separate questions, but I really wanted to make sure we talk about both of them because I thought they were both fascinating. So start with burnout.
Yeah. So I mean, I can talk a little bit about burnout, and then I want to talk a little more about the kind of of how I think what's happening in our physiology when we practice the A method. I think that
Yeah.
kind of ties it together. But so, yeah. So briefly, I mean, in a big problem in medicine, as in many service industries, is burnout. And during the height of the pandemic, the American Medical Association had surveyed 20,000 doctors, and over half of them were like severely burned out, ready to quit medicine. And obviously, there's a public health crisis. If half the doctors and nurses quit their jobs, like we're all in very big trouble in terms of the healthcare system. And like I said, I shared with you, I have my own kind of burnout experience. I'm a pain management specialist, which is probably one of the harder fields of medicine, of working with people all throughout the day that are struggling with severe chronic disabling pain.
Mhm.
So there's two aspects in which, personally, how I use this method in my day-to-day practice. And I think it can be applicable for whatever you do, whether you practice law or you work at a grocery store and you do customer service work, you wait tables. So one step I do is that when I'm done with a patient care interaction, I take an awe break, a brief, like we're talking like, 10, 15 seconds. So when I walk out of the room, I have a moment of awe to reset my nervous system, to like access that state of spacious consciousness, even just for a few moments. And then I'm feeling refreshed and cleared out so that I can go be fresh for the next patient that I see. So I'm not carrying around that residue from room to room to room, which then, you think about that stimulus and response model. Oh my God, like here's my 15th patient today who's got a pain flare up and who's like just totally struggling. And then that wears you down as a practitioner. What I love about this practice is that I really, really do feel clean and fresh for every interaction, because I give myself that moment of a reset of my nervous system. I'm really fortunate in my clinic. We have beautiful artwork that's colorful and bright. So I can just look at some of the artwork in our clinic and just feel really awe-inspired by that. Mm-hmm. And then the other thing is you can have awe with people that you're actually working with. And so I share moments of awe with my patients. They share them with me. I ask them about what awe they've had in their life lately. And there's one thing that's really profound about moments of awe is that they're contagious in a very good way. Mm-hmm. So when I share a moment of awe with someone, or they share one with me, it stimulates an awe within myself. Like when I hear about someone's story of awe, like I experience a moment of awe with that. Mm-hmm. We actually have on our website, we call it the Moment of Awe page at thepowerofawe.com. If you click on one of the menu options of try it now, there's an option of viewing other people's moments of awe, and you can post your moment of awe there as well and share your awe. And it's a really beautiful thing that we can do as a community. So let's talk a little bit now. We'll shift gear, talking about like what's happening in our physiology and why this helps with burnout and other kind of stress response states. So there's really 4 mechanisms of what awe is doing when we have that moment to our physiology. So first of all, when I shared about the method and how it works, you're taking that deep exhale, you're stimulating the vagus nerve. And so we know from brain imaging studies and measuring heart rate variability and different parameters that awe brings us to that parasympathetic state of rest and restoration. Mm-hmm. That's one thing. So we're kind of counteracting the sympathetic fight-flight, and we're going to the rest and healing state.
Yeah, so closing the stress cycle, right? Basically, I talk about this sometimes, and that's the language I use. So moving out of fight or flight and into rest and relaxation. Yeah, perfect.
Exactly. Okay. Yeah. Second is we are releasing oxytocin, which is that trust, bonding, connection hormone, which has a whole bunch of positive cascades and benefits. Okay. We're also, third is quieting what's called the default mode network. And that's the parts of the brain. It's situated in different little areas, but it's basically where the monkey mind rests. It's the part of our mind that races and is always thinking about things and random thoughts. And what we do is when we have a moment of awe, we're resetting the default mode network and we're becoming very present and quieting down our mind. Mm-hmm. And then the fourth thing that I think is probably, for me as a scientist, like really the most inspiring is what happens with inflammation in our body and inflammatory cytokines. So I'll share a little bit of the background of what cytokines are. And really when I share this, I mean, I think it's so awe-inspiring. It's like it's a moment of conceptual awe. So when life evolved on this planet, and Earth is about 4 billion years old, about 1 billion years ago or so, when life started to evolve, single cellular organisms, they would communicate with each other with protein molecules that are called cytokines. And there's basically two categories of cytokines. There's cytokines that say that we're safe, that those little organisms were safe. And then so it would bring other organisms to them, and then they could collaborate and work together. Or there was cytokines that say threat. It's dangerous, stay away. Well, as evolution has happened, this model of safe versus threat is really the basis of like how we're wired neurophysiologically, as well as like biochemically in our bodies. It's about safety versus threat. And our immune system totally works on this method. And cytokines are used to communicate when there's a threat, to bring in like white blood cells and different cellular mechanisms to like fight an infection if you like cut yourself, or to have a fever to fight off like a bacterial infection systemically. These are all mediated by cytokines, which is like one of the oldest cellular mechanisms on the entire planet. Like, how cool is that?
Yeah, I think it's so cool. I would describe that like when I used to talk about food a lot. And so I'd get into like kind of what was happening in your body, whatever. Anyway, I'd talk about inflammatory and anti-inflammatory, nutrients and that kind of thing. But I used to always say that there was like the first line of defense that comes in and is like, Houston, we have a problem. And it's like raising a red flag and it's making a mess, so that the rest of your body pays attention to it. But now it makes more sense to me. It's like the threat, it's noticing the threat and it's raising the alarm basically, which is great in the short term, but not great if it's chronic, right?
It's not great. And that's the problem, is that, and what we're learning in medicine is that basically being in a chronic stress state leads to this cascade of all these different chronic health conditions. Mm-hmm. So, for example, diabetes is an inflammatory state. Heart disease, cardiovascular disease is an inflammatory state. Cancer is an inflammatory state. All the autoimmune diseases, Sjogren's, lupus, MS, like all these rheumatoid arthritis, they're all autoimmune problems where it's inflammation attacking our own body.
Right.
Because we're under this chronic stress state. Now, researchers looked at all these different positive emotions like love, empathy, gratitude, and awe, and took people's blood values when they were experiencing these different emotions. And awe was the only positive emotion that actually lowers the biggest, baddest inflammatory cytokine, which is interleukin-6.
Wow.
And so we talk about this in our book, about how powerful this practice is, because even though we're just thinking and we're experiencing these moments of awe, we change our neurochemistry. I don't know if we know the exact mechanism where, but the glial cells in the brain, they secrete a lot of these cytokines. So it's probably right there where it's happening. And then they're creating that state of safety, of rest and healing that needs to happen. And yeah, I mean, we talk about this in our book. We have like a whole section of our book dedicated to this. And I really love the conversations that we have, because I mean, there's a lot more evidence than ever before about how important it is to be in a sense of safe, for healing to really happen, a deep healing to happen. We have to feel safe. And then it really ties into like a bigger social public health crisis issue, is that there's so many communities out there that are marginalized and suffering and struggling on a very deep level. People of color, native peoples, people that are struggling socioeconomically, that can barely feed themselves. And they're like in a constant stress state day to day, like trying to provide food or housing. I mean, all these different population groups struggle the most with heart disease, diabetes, obesity, and all these things. And it's because of when you're in that chronic stress state, your body is in a survival mode and holding on to calories, and then hence, diabetes and autoimmune types of conditions happen. Yeah, it's really intense to think about
Yeah.
the complexity of this problem. And I
Yeah.
think awe is just one little piece of it. It's not the solution, but we know that from other people's studies that our culture is awe-starved. Our education system is devoid of awe. It used to be that there was a sense of awe and wonder and learning about the natural world and education. But the more we've disconnected from awe from the natural world, the more we're on our devices. It's the complete opposite. We feel disconnected from each other. We're alone. We're not feeling connected to the natural world, the natural cycles of the world. Yeah.
Yeah. No, it makes total sense. Thank you for answering both pieces of my question, by the way. It was a very confusing, long question, but that's exactly what I wanted to make sure we covered, because I found that chapter, I mean, I was underlining all over the place in it. I just found it so fascinating, like the science piece of it and why this works. And there's this line in the book where you talk about how we can make other people feel safe and how valuable that is to other people. And it's in the context of this conversation of these I'm going to pronounce it wrong. Is it cytokines or cytokines? Cytokines. The threatening ones, the ones we most of us have too many of, flooding ourselves all the time, and just how we actually can do something, sort of separate and apart from this practice of awe, but just how meaningful it can be to other people to help them feel safe. And I underlined that because I thought that should be a guiding principle for a human, to go out and try to do that. And I'm not sure I'm mindful of that all the time, but I loved that. I loved that idea. And I just loved how all of this tied in. It made so much sense to me around the burnout piece, how this could be such a helpful practice in terms of pulling you out of fight or flight and closing that stress cycle and reminding your brain that everything's okay and you're not being chased by that saber-toothed tiger. And, it's okay for things to return to a state of rest and relaxation. But mostly the thing that's the most awesome about this practice is the fact that it's so brief. And it feels, given the research that you have to date on it, it just feels almost too good to be true that this really short practice several times a day can lead to all of these really incredible positive health consequences. So it's for that reason alone, after I read the introduction to the book, I think I only read like 10 pages and I was like, I'm in. I would love to interview this person because this is just so fascinating to me, but it also makes such sense to me from a science perspective, why it works. So thank you so much for sharing all of that with us. What are you guys doing? Like, is this something that you continue to be involved in terms of research? Do you have ideas about where you want to take this down the road? I mean, it feels to me like it could be applicable in so many different categories. I was talking to you before we hit record about how I was thinking this could be quite helpful for people in recovery or in active addiction who are trying to break free from substances or alcohol. It's just a way to calm yourself down, to manage anxiety, to learn how to be in the present moment, and all of that. So where are you still working with Jake, and where are you guys going next with this?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. So we are doing more research and we're really excited about that. I've partnered up with Dr. Lopez. He's the head of the cardiology research at UC Davis. And our next study is actually launching in the middle of April. So people can sign up after hearing this. It's a COVID long study. So we're enrolling people that are struggling with the complications of having COVID and, brain fog, fatigue, chronic pain. It's so sad, but about 10% of Americans, I'm not sure the number of Canadians, but I'm sure it's quite similar, are struggling with these chronic health symptoms after COVID. And there's really no medication or easy solution. So if you're interested, go to our website and email us at the info@thepowerofawe.com. I can send you a direct link to the study information, or you could search out the UC Davis study pages, and it's called the Positive Emotion Study for long COVID. Cool. And then we're also just really excited about studying more about these inflammatory cytokines. And I know we're looking at doing a big grant eventually with our Institutes of Health around the mechanisms around heart disease and awe.
Yeah.
So there's There's a lot there. And
Like there's so much there. I could talk to you for another hour, but I've just realized we're almost at the hour and I don't know where that
yeah,
time, there's so
it's
much.
amazing.
Yeah.
Well, I love as we close up, I'd love to read a little bit from the book and share
Yeah.
some lines from our epilogue, because although we've talked a lot about how this is a personal practice, I think that the implications of this practice go way beyond the individual. And yes, it's simple, but I'll tell you, as someone who's been in this work for now 4 years, that the practice deepens, and which is even richer, I was just recently exploring the idea of weight in more depth in my life. Like, I'm like we were sharing, I'm high achieving multitasker, but learning to really slow down and wait and be more present with my patients. And it's just brought out of respect and love and care for them, it's brought a deeper sense of meaning and purpose in my work as a physician. So there's just so many nuggets to be learned as we deepen in this practice. So I'd like to read a little bit from the book. The A.W.E method is more than a self-help technique, and the implications of A.W.E go well beyond personal transformation. A.W.E touches everything, and perhaps most telling is the effect it has on others. We're wired to attune to others' behaviors and moods. Our nervous system senses the emotions of those around us. Just as being the recipient of a warm smile can lighten our mood, when we're in awe, those around us feel it too. Awe is contagious, and so practicing the A.W.E method is one not so small way we can contribute to the world. In this book, we covered how the A.W.E method is grounded in science, and that a whole body of science supports that A.W.E changes lives. So we have a big, simple crash ending to the power behind the simple practice of the A.W.E method. If practiced frequently enough by enough people, a critical mass as it were, everyone would experience a significant heightened shift in consciousness. A.W.E changes us, and when we share our awe, we change the world. How can we be in awe of someone and physically or emotionally harm them? How can we be in awe of someone and physically or emotionally harm them? How can we be in awe of the natural world and destroy it? How can we be in awe of life itself and not live as if every day were a miracle? In awe, the tone of every conversation, from the personal to political, shifts. From having an agenda to being open and curious. Our conversations impact how we raise our kids, how we help our aging parents, how we treat our spouse, how we participate in community, how we mentor or supervise people, how we govern, and how we lead a nation. We can think of no downside to practicing the A.W.E method, because awe is the light, the appreciation of nature in different cultures, the curious and open mind, the generous and giving soul, even during times of darkness. These days, we need awe more than ever. So awe awaits you and surrounds you in the ordinary moments of your life. Like the view of the stars that fill the night sky, awe is free and available. All you need to do is pay attention to what you value, appreciate, and find amazing. Wait, and then exhale and expand into the unlimited timelessness of awe.
That's awesome. Literally and figuratively. I love that. Thank you for sharing that. I felt that feeling as you were reading that. Interestingly, I felt some emotion as you read that. And I did when I read it in the book as well, when I read it the first time. Thank you so much for taking the time out to talk to me today about this. Has been so interesting. Honestly, I feel like if you do another study and you want to talk about it, call me. I'm such a nerd. I should have gone into science. Instead, I stayed in arts, but I just find it all so fascinating. And if people want to purchase the book is available. I assume all the details on where to find the book are available on the website, which I'll put in the show notes. But is the book available just generally online on Amazon and at booksellers? How do people find it?
It's everywhere. Yeah,
Yay.
and support your local bookseller. They need our support more than ever.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so you can find
Imagine
it.
a world without bookstores. How sad that would be.
It would be so sad. I have a moment of awe every time I walk into a bookstore. It's my favorite place to be. So,
right?
Yes. So support your independent local booksellers and get this book.
it's so compelling when you read it. I always love a book that has the science to back it up. And obviously this does. And I think you're right. I think this is just the beginning. It's the tip of the iceberg. And I think the potential benefits of this body of research and growing practice for individuals, but also for humankind is kind of boundless. And that's really exciting. So thank you for being here with us today. It's been a real treat talking to you.
Oh, thank you, Wendy. And it was such a joy to meet your community of listeners. Thank you so much.
You've been listening to Bite Size Balance with your host, Wendy McCallum. As a burnout and balance coach, I help busy high achievers like you create a more balanced, joyful life. Ready to create a life you don't want to escape from? Download your free Blueprint for Change now. This incredible workbook includes some of my favorite coaching tools and will help you get clear on what you need more and less of in your life. Grab it at www.wendymccallum.com/blueprint. That's www.wendymccallum.com/blueprint.